Hello and welcome to the Next American Built Environment, Episode 2. My name is Michael Sweeney. I'm very excited about our topic this week. We're talking tenant protections and the COVID-19 eviction crisis. Since the COVID pandemic first hit, we've been undergoing what they call a K-shaped recovery, with a quick rebound for the wealthy and for homeowners, and a lot of economic pain for working class Americans and renters in particular. There have been eviction moratoriums that have helped mitigate the impact at the state level and the federal level, but many are a little weaker than you would want them to be, and many are expiring very soon. In a moment, I'll be joined by Shanti Singh to talk about the eviction crisis in California. Then later in the program, we'll be joined by Carr to talk about the eviction crisis in New York City. Shanti Singh is the Legislative and Communications Director of Tenants Together. It's a renters' rights organization in California. I should note before we start that we recorded this interview nearly a month ago, but there's still no legislative deal out of Sacramento to extend the eviction moratorium. Just today, news broke that there is a deal being brokered by Governor Newsom that would partially extend the eviction moratorium to June, but with a lot of caveats that make it maybe a little weaker than you would want it to be. Anyway, there's still no resolution to that, but keep that in mind when we talk about that in the interview. Here is our interview. Shanti, welcome to the show.
Hi, happy to be here.
So the first thing I wanted to ask, California has one of the worst housing crises in the country. What was the scale of the eviction and homelessness crisis in California before COVID struck?
Yeah, it was already pretty bad. I think in terms of, I think the average rent in California was, $1,400. The median rent in California was $1,400. That was already out of reach for a lot of people.
And that's for a one bedroom or a studio. We're not even talking about a house
exactly.
or a 3-bedroom.
Yeah, like a studio or 1 bedroom. That was already out of reach for a lot of people. We were already reaching, upwards approaching like in the hundreds of thousands, definitely what the homeless population was in California. Already an incredibly high, unacceptable number. Like I live in San Francisco, and in San Francisco, there's the lowball estimate of unhoused people in this one city is 8,000. It's possibly or likely a lot more than that. So if you multiply that across the whole state, there were a lot of unhoused folks in California way before this. And obviously the rents keep going up and up over the last many, many years. That's only as evictions. I think on average, there were 167,000 evictions in court a year, which means you're kind of undercounting other incidents where like evictions did not proceed to court. So that was already the sort of annual total before the pandemic in like 2015, 2016, 2017, as early as we have data for, because that can be kind of slow. So, if you think about that, if you extrapolate that out, that means it was something like 1 in every 34 California renters was evicted in court like every year. So, sometimes it's the same people, but yeah, that was what it was. That was what it was like pre-pandemic.
In some of California's largest cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles, they have rent control laws, but the rent control laws in these cities are a little less good than I think people think they are. What are some of the loopholes and weaknesses in these laws that allow or incentivize landlords to do evictions?
Yeah, with San Francisco and Los Angeles especially, there's a couple things. I'll start with the state level preemption. So there's something called the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act that was passed by the real estate industry. I believe it passed by one vote in 1994, 1995 is when it took effect. And what it means is that if you're a city, it limits how much rent control, what you can extend rent control to if you're a municipality, right? Because rent control happens on the municipal level. So most municipalities in California don't have rent control, but some of them like SF and LA, some of the bigger ones have passed it. So, they're limited in what kind of units they're able to rent control. So they can't rent control condos, they can't rent control single family homes. But there's also something called vacancy decontrol, where no city can enact vacancy control of any kind. And that basically regulates what happens when a tenant in a rent controlled apartment leaves the unit, whether they leave on their own volition or they pass away or they're forced out. So basically Costa-Hawkins prohibited any cities from passing any kind of vacancy control at all. And so for that reason, if you are fortunate enough to live in a rent-controlled unit in California or live in a city that's passed it, your landlord still has a pretty strong incentive to get you out of that unit, because then they can reset the base rent of that unit to whatever they want. So, like let's say you were paying $1,500 a month somewhere in a rent controlled unit in San Francisco, like your landlord definitely has an incentive to get you out. Because then, even though the apartment's not technically rent controlled, what they charge the next person could be just market rate, or it could be higher, it could be lower. It's totally up to them. So that piece has led to a lot of harassment of tenants, in an attempt to get them to leave their rent controlled units. And then the other two pieces that are there's something called the Ellis Act, which is also statewide. It was meant to actually enable landowners to quote unquote exit the market. So by selling off their properties. But then they could basically legally evict the entire building worth of tenants when they're selling that building. Now, presumably it was for exiting the market, but a lot of landlords are not actually exiting the market in any way. It's it's a tool of speculation. So they can, someone selling the property, they can invoke the Ellis Act and get all the tenants out.
My understanding of the Ellis Act is when they passed it, kind of the scenario was it would be a single family homeowner who had a renter and wanted to, evict that renter and take the rental unit off the market. It wasn't really intended to be used by these huge commercial landlords the way it is now.
Yeah, exactly. And, there have been attempts to reform it. There's a lot of resistance to that in Sacramento, obviously. But most of the time, I think the Coalition on Economic Survival in Los Angeles did something where they were estimating that Ellis Acts were they were losing or affecting 5 rent controlled units every single day in Los Angeles. That was from a couple of years ago. But yeah, it's been used very heavily as an excuse to evict rent controlled tenants for rent controlled buildings. And then the last piece, I think there's also, there's a condo conversion laws. That's that's an issue in San Francisco. I think Ellis Act is more of an issue in LA. It really depends. But with condo conversion laws, basically, if you can get the tenant out, you can convert the specific unit into a condo or something called a tenancy in common, which I don't really need to get into too many of the details of that. But there's a lot of different, there are a lot of different loopholes. There are ways to work around rent control. That is, even if you have it. And as a result, some of the bigger landlords in San Francisco, there's one called Veritas, which owns, I think, something 250 buildings in the city, buildings, which is a lot for SF. And, they're currently facing several class action lawsuits, where tenants are reporting, that they fell into, they were doing quote unquote repairs, but what it actually was amounted to was effectively harassment, making it unlivable for rent controlled tenants to live in their unit and operate. So there was some stories a guy fell into sewage coming out of his bathroom sink faucet, stuff like that. Those are all real stories. And this is from a larger, more institutional landlord in San Francisco. So, I mean, those lawsuits I don't think have been settled or resolved yet, but there are several class action lawsuits against them for basically engaging in, allegedly, don't want to get sued, a pattern of targeted harassment across hundreds of properties. So.
And given what the penalties are for some of these, I mean, there's almost no downside to the landlords to engage in this kind of stuff, because even if you get caught, even if you get sued, it's, a kind of slap on the wrist in a lot of cases, is my understanding.
Yeah, cost of doing business, basically.
So that was the situation at the beginning of the year before COVID hit. California's been hit really hard by COVID. Renters in California, I think, has been hit especially hard. How has the COVID-19 crisis made the eviction crisis worse? Do we have an idea of what the numbers are like in terms of how many tenants are facing eviction, and beyond those just facing eviction, people facing back rent? Because even in places that have had eviction moratoriums, the rent doesn't go away. This is just incurring a debt on people month after month.
Yeah, it's been, unfortunately, getting the actual court data is something that tenant organizations, we've been working on nonstop, and it's been really difficult. They just haven't, our court system has not been forthcoming with this data on the county level or at the state level, which is really disappointing. So I wish I had more specifics there. But, we do know that, according to point in time kind of census data, that I think 2 million households in California, 2 million renter households are reporting that they're not going to be able to pay their January rent. So that kind of gives you an idea of how bad it's gotten. There for a lot of people who've been long-term out of work, every single month they're less able to pay their rent than they were the month before. But 2 million is effectively where we're at now, which is huge. California is a big state, but California is what, 40 million people and 18 million renters. So, I mean, if you're looking at 2 million renter households, like that's really a lot. That's a huge chunk of the state. I think, yeah, I mean, that's the sort of latest we have in terms of what's happening in court. Like that's more ambiguous, unfortunately, just because we're not getting that information. But I do think also, now that I think about it, I think the Turner Center, which is at UC Berkeley, in terms of their latest estimate of how many people are behind on their rents, they think it's a quarter of renter households in California, which would line up with that, with the 2 million that I cited, if you consider that those are households and there are 18 million renters, period. And that I think 17 or 18% of California property owners are behind on their mortgages. So, I mean, that's millions and millions of people. That's so many people. It's not really a profound thing for me to say. It's just like every time I'm looking at it or think about it, it doesn't feel any less staggering.
Yeah, and I think the scale of the problem, I mean, it seems like the legislators are maybe not quite aware of how dire things are for Californians out there.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
in terms, in theory, Democratic governor, heavily Democratic majorities in both houses of the state legislature, a lot of cities that are very Democratic. You would think that this would be a place where there's a lot of state action to make this easier, but we haven't really seen that from Sacramento yet, have we?
No, no. I mean, I think what's really staggering to me, among many things that are staggering to me right now, is that Governor Newsom technically he does have a decent amount of unilateral executive authority as the governor of California to impose restrictions on eviction, which means he essentially has had the option to do so by a stroke of his pen of his own volition since April. Right? It's been almost like so for the last 8 months. He hasn't. He's been very reluctant, or he's completely unwilling to do that. So that's thing one. And then thing two is that the state legislature, in terms of what their response to this was, they passed a bill that was mostly brokered by Governor Newsom and banking and banks and like real estate interests, tenant groups. We tried to be at the table, but it was very hard. In terms of what they passed something that's called AB 3088, which is very partial. I wouldn't call it an eviction moratorium. They're eviction protections or guidelines. That's going to expire at the end of January. So I think there was which is really bizarre if you consider that means the implication there is that they were expecting that everybody would be back to normal, California renters and workers and families and even small property owners, that everybody would be back on their feet by January 31st. So now we're fighting to extend that. But if you think about, sort of the context behind why that date, it's really baffling. I think that they are slow to act, and I don't think that they necessarily are taking the scale of this crisis seriously. I hope they are now, but I mean, we're gonna have that fight all over again. We are already about how long is it going to take until we expect every tenant to be able to pay their rent in full? It certainly isn't the end of next month.
Yeah, I mean, we're sitting here recording this at the end of December, and I haven't looked at the numbers this week, but it seems like COVID cases in California are about as bad as they've ever been. We're back in this sort of low-level lockdown where all the restaurants are closed, all the stores are closed, and a lot of people are still out of work. And it seems insane to me that they are expecting all the renters to be caught up, because there's just
Yeah.
there's no way you can make that happen after how this year has been.
Yeah, no. And, I mean, it keeps getting worse, if anything, as people drop into the ranks of the long-term unemployed. I think I read somewhere recently that in the last week or so that there's something like, I think 300,000 Californians, mostly disproportionately women, had basically stopped seeking work, according to the point by point unemployment statistics. That's really not good. That's not a sign that we're out of the woods yet, just because we have a vaccine or something like that. So, yeah, I mean, it's a completely ridiculous expectation, and we'll see how they try to extend it this time. I mean, that's something that we're working on to represent the tenant side. But, in terms of what the legislators are thinking, when they think they're going to be out of the woods on this, I mean, it's not going to be, for people to recover, we're talking years. We're not talking months.
Yeah, because it's not just, making this month's rent. A lot of this is now there's this huge debt for people who are already paying very high rents. What are the proposals that are in Sacramento right now for extending the moratorium or other renter relief going forward?
Yeah, so we have what the tenant groups are working on, or at least have some input in, or what we're trying to push through right now are two bills. There's Assembly Bill 15 and Assembly Bill 16. AB 15 and 16 are sponsored by my assembly member who represents me in Eastern San Francisco, David Chu, who's usually pretty bold guy when it comes to land use and tenant legislation. So we're working with him, and that's the bill, that's the vehicle for negotiation right now. AB 15, the reason it's two different bills is because 15 has to be passed by January 31st. Otherwise, the protections that we do have, again, as limited as they are, and a lot of people have fallen through the cracks, even those will expire, and people will be expected to pay their full rent for February, on February 1st, basically, or March 1st. So, we can't, letting that expire is not an option, but to pass it quickly, it's going to require 2/3 majority in the state legislature. So a super majority. So we have to get it with a supermajority passed by January 31st and on Gavin Newsom's desk. That's not going to be any small feat for sure. So that's already active. And then 16 is a longer term bill to kind of begin to flesh out. It's not completely fleshed out right now, but it's to flesh out these longer term issues like debt, especially debt, and how we're going to tackle that question, especially when renters are in something like $6,000 total of debt, I think is a figure that came out from Moody's for impacted renters. So
and that's on average. That's not even talking about some of the more extreme cases.
Yeah. I think they took a pool of 12 million American renters, a lot of whom are probably in California, because California, I think, has 25% of America's renters population. So, that was just a calculation. There's a lot of people probably do a whole lot more. But that was their average for that sort of pool, where they were saying it's $6,000 by January. So AB 16 is going to tackle a lot of the longer term issues, we're hoping. No, not we're hoping, but we're going to be going full court press on this. But it hasn't been fleshed out as yet, just because there's some moving parts with how much federal relief are we going to get? All of those issues, what kind of programs are most effective? As you may have heard, I think Pennsylvania had $150 million in CARES Act funding for rent relief, and they didn't spend 100 million of that 150 in time, and now it's going to correctional facilities. And that was because of program flaws that the state housing agency pointed out, and a recalcitrant state legislature that wasn't willing to fix them. So there's a lot to learn from, I think, in terms of how these things have gone wrong through the pandemic, and hopefully we'll address those in 16. But right now, the goal is to get 15 passed, because letting these protections expire, as flawed as they are, is not an option. What I will say is that there's always been, I understand that states can't run budget deficits, right? I get that. But, in California's case, I think the legislature and especially the governor have kind of been reluctant to do any kind of relief on their own. I mean, there's stuff like Project Roomkey, which unfortunately is winding down to house homeless people in hotels. That had federal funding, right? There was some state funding. But in general, when it comes to renter protections, there's been a lot of sort of wait and see. We'll wait for the feds. We'll wait for the feds. The feds will save us. And that's something, when this AB 3088, which is this partial eviction protection that is expiring, when that was passed at the end of August, what we heard from several folks in Sacramento, legislators, the governor's office, et cetera, was that, this is temporary. This is a temporary bill. It expires January 31st because the federal government is going to step in. Hopefully we'll have an election, et cetera. They were saying this in August, right? Which was already kind of I don't like to guess about how the election's going to go until it's over. That was already a bit bold of them to assume. But even then, there's going to, I think even then, if Joe Biden had won, which he did, he would be president for 10 days, I think, by January 31st. So, the idea that there is kind of an expectation, I think, that's naive, that the federal government, especially the outcome we did end up having, But, with like, so many Republicans like controlling the Senate, like absent like the best possible outcome, it was not going to be likely that they were going to be able to solve all of our problems as far as funding and rent relief and stuff. And unfortunately, that expectation, or at least it's been cited. I mean, that's what they're saying out loud. Is like, the feds will say this. And I mean, I think given everything that's going on, especially now with the Georgia runoffs, like I think that's tenuous.
Yeah, Joe Manchin coming in for the big tenant rescue, I think, is not something that I would hold my breath for.
Yeah.
But on the other side, something that I found encouraging is that we are seeing some direct action from the people about protecting tenants who are vulnerable, protesting evictions or other actions along those lines. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, especially in San Francisco, Los Angeles, definitely, but across the country. I mean, what we saw in places like Kansas City and New Orleans too, like where like tenant organizations and tenants and like affiliate like progressive organizations and general coalitions of people are doing stuff like locking up locking up eviction courts or blockading eviction courts physically. We see in SF, I mean, this was before the pandemic, or sorry, Oakland, not SF. I would get in trouble for saying that. In Oakland, where, Moms for Housing, which is a group of formerly homeless mothers, they made national news by occupying a house with their children where they were forcibly removed by tanks, which was pretty wild. But, they ended up getting housing, and they succeeded in their aim to point out this corporate landlord Wedgwood that's leaving properties vacant. And actually now that Moms for Housing landlord Wedgwood is now during the pandemic paying other homeless people to guard their vacant properties across America from homeless people, which is something I saw last week. That's just a new level of dark. But Moms for Housing, they did prevail in making this a story and making it a tactic that other people are using. They even actually kind of got a law passed in the state legislature that is talking about acquiring vacant properties or giving cities the option or nonprofits the option to acquire vacant properties in California. So that was a cool legal or legislative victory for them. But there were folks in El Sereno like occupying vacant housing on Caltrans land. So Caltrans is the state transit agency. It's public land. The housing has been sitting vacant for a very, very long time because they had acquired that land to like knock it down to build a highway or expand a highway. I think it was 10. I forget which highway. That never passed. So that land has just been sitting there with that housing. And Caltrans has been slow in selling it off. So you saw these moms and these kids like occupying that housing in LA. And they were forcibly removed on Thanksgiving night, which was really, again, by like really like armed to the teeth cops and tanks.
It's almost like it's reminiscent of like the Great Depression. You read about, people protecting widows' farms and things like that from being foreclosed upon. Like, I think there's something that's just morally abhorrent about evicting families into a pandemic that perhaps is getting people riled up in a way that they wouldn't have been a year ago.
Yeah. And, I mean, the thing is, too, like we've seen so many, I mean, Tenants Together where I work, but a lot of other organizations and our member organizations, like we've been seeing and training people about community defense because like what we're also seeing is a lot of illegal lockouts. So not only like this didn't happen, there was no court case, there was no eviction case or anything like that. Your landlord threw all of your crap out on the street and then called the cops on you. That is unsurprisingly happening disproportionately to Black and Latinx tenants, right? That's probably not that surprising. I think there was an LA Times investigation a few months ago that said like almost all of the ones in LA that they could document were happening in South LA. And I think like only in the last couple of weeks, I think that under a lot of pressure, not just from like renter groups, but because of everything that's been going on with Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, with a progressive DA that they just elected, he's finally kind of feeling the heat and saying like, okay, well, nominally the sheriffs won't, do these lockouts, but it's an illegal lockout. It's an extrajudicial eviction to begin with. So, the fact that the cops have no compunction about like enforcing something that is inherently illegal, is already pretty messed up. But, they are kind of I think there is a tie-in to like the kind of action, direct action, even in the pandemic and protest that, that tenants and tenant groups are engaging in across the country and in California. There's a tie-in to, what's happening with Black Lives Matter, what's happening like in the fight against like police brutality, which is because like evictions are enforced by police brutality, right? So there is sort of there's a common, thread that these things are weaving together, and also like a common thread of, envisioning what real community defense looks like. And so especially against these illegal lockouts, like you can't go up against the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department by yourself when your stuff is on the street. Right. So I think that those are things that make me feel, I mean, they're horrible. But in terms of the tactics that people are using to respond to them, even with the whole need for social distancing and all of that stuff, like that's something I'm very heartened by, that people are getting creative, and people are engaging in action like collectively so that they aren't, dealing with these things alone.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's really important to understand. Like even in places that have relatively good tenant protections, sometimes it's only as good as your ability to hire a lawyer, your ability to know the rules going into it. And there's a lot of unscrupulous landlords who don't mind breaking the law if it means they can evict a tenant and raise the rent or whatever they're going to do. Having on the ground organizing, I think, is extremely important in terms of actually making sure that the landlords follow the little law that there is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and unfortunately, like the enforcement question is something that we do try to get state support on, but they've been reluctant to do that. I think we tried to. There was a rent cap bill that passed that applies to, I think, like 7 to 10% of properties, but it was like it was a big deal. It was the first time any kind of rent cap had been passed in the state legislature, I think, ever. And that was, I think, it's not quite rent control. But anyway, we tried to put forward a bill this year that would enable city, county, and district attorneys across California to enforce that rent cap. So we were asking the legislature to pass a bill that would promise local enforcement of a law that they had already passed a year prior. And that went absolutely nowhere, right? So a lot of these protections are just completely on paper. A lot of the time. And like you can't, if you don't have a local organizing presence or, a local know your rights presence or whatever, if you're a tenant union, if you're just an organization that does legal aid, or if your organization doesn't do mostly housing, but you're doing counseling or something like that, or you're doing community organizing, it's like that whole infrastructure needs to be there to protect people, because like that protection is not coming from the state.
Well, Shanti, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Before we move on to our next segment, I want to issue a correction from last week's episode. In the episode, our slide on current San Diego Mayor Todd Gloria got his dates in office as a city councilman wrong. He was in office from 2008 to 2016. We had it as 2006 to 2014. And we also said that San Diego mayoral candidate Barbara Bree had opposed the Midway District rezoning. She actually supported the rezoning, but opposed the height limit increase, Measure E, that we talked about. Apologies to both Todd Gloria and to Barbara Bree for getting that wrong. And thank you to Andrew Bowen of KPBS for flagging those errors in the comments. I take accuracy pretty seriously. So if and when you see me make a mistake, please flag it in a comment or let me know on Twitter. We do want to make sure we get everything right. So if there's a mistake, we want to correct it. One thing I want to add is that the current workflow of the show has me adding the slides that you see after the interviews are finished. So my guests don't see them. They don't write them. If there's an error on a slide or something that's inaccurate on a slide, that's 100% on me and should not be taken as a reflection of the guests. Some other housekeeping notes. We're now on Apple Podcasts. We are on Google Podcasts. Whatever other podcast app you use, we should be available. Links to those are in the episode description. If you're interested in getting the audio-only version of the show, follow those links. Subscribe. It's free. Getting the subscriber numbers up really helps the show find new listeners. If you're watching this on YouTube and you like what you see, scroll down, click that red subscribe button below the video. You'll get notified whenever we have a new episode or new content. Even if you're not watching on YouTube, you might want to do this anyway because we're planning on having some YouTube-only bonus content that will be exclusive to the platform. you're going to want to make sure you're subscribed so that you can see that when that's available. It's free. Subscribing helps support the show. Our next guest is Aaron Carr. Aaron is the founder and executive director of the Housing Rights Initiative. It's a nonprofit in New York City. Here is our interview. Aaron, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start off by taking a step back before we had this whole COVID crisis. What was the state of tenants' rights in New York City before the COVID crisis hit?
Well, housing is a complicated subject, so I'll give a little bit of a complicated answer. I view tenants' rights as a broad term that encompasses many different categories of tenants. So I think it's important to break it down, right? Because you have rent-stabilized tenants and you have market rate tenants, and then there are rent-burdened tenants and non-rent burdened tenants, and then there are incumbent tenants who live in New York City, and there are non-incumbent tenants who would love to live in New York City but can't afford to. And broadly speaking, each category of tenant has different challenges and different needs and different rights. So you have the rent-stabilized tenant, which has the strongest rights, right? The rent-stabilized tenant is entitled to incremental rent increases and automatic renewal leases. You have the market rate tenant that has the weakest rights, and their situation is basically at the whims of the market. And they aren't entitled to the incremental rent increases or the automatic renewal leases, which in my opinion is why we need universal rent control. And then lastly, you have the non-incumbent tenant who effectively, has no rights at all. And this is the tenant who doesn't live in New York City, who would love to live in New York City, but can't afford to live in New York City because of our local immigration laws, also known as exclusionary zoning. And just so you know, New York City builds less housing per capita than any other large city in America. And we totally suck when it comes to the creation of affordable and social housing. And this effectively infringes upon the rights of non-incumbent tenants, particularly immigrants and people of color who would love to live in New York City but can't. So I would argue that tenants' rights is complicated, and you kind of have to break it down by each category of tenant.
Absolutely. And, I think there's something like, I don't know the exact number. It's over 1 million rent stabilized units in the city, which is a lot, but it only goes so far. There's not a lot of new units that come in under that system. I think there was some hope when they were renewing the laws that they would add or expand the system to include more units, post 1973. And that hasn't really happened yet. But let's talk about the rent stabilization laws first a little bit. So how have the revisions to the rent stabilization laws in 2019 changed the landscape for landlords and for renters?
Well, it was definitely a game changer. I mean, the 2019 rent stabilization overhaul was great because it strengthened New York City's rent stabilization system and closed a number of loopholes. Like previously, when tenants vacated a rent stabilized unit, landlords could hike the rent by like 20%. That is no longer the case. The law also imposes stricter regulation on individual apartment improvements, what they call it IAIs, and major capital improvements. Under the old system, a landlord could claim an unlimited amount in individual apartment improvements and jack up the rent by hundreds, if not thousands of dollars at a vacancy. Now there's a cap to those increases. And I think the most, my organization, Housing Rights Initiative, we investigate fraud. And the real estate companies were using these loopholes that I just mentioned to inflate rents in excess of what they were allowed to charge. So the old rent stabilization system effectively legalized fraud. And for example, in one building we investigated, a landlord was claiming to have done $100,000 or more in apartment improvements in these like tiny little studio apartments. And like tenants would ask me, well, how do I know if my landlord, actually didn't spend $100,000 in apartment improvements in my studio apartment? And I would respond, well, did your apartment come with a gold-plated toilet seat and an effing butler? Because that's the only way your landlord could be claiming this. So the rent stabilization laws did a really good job, the new rent stabilization laws, of closing these loopholes and making it harder for landlords to illegally overcharge tenants. And the effects, by the way, even though these laws are pretty new, the effects have been profound. In the wake of those reforms, evictions plummeted because it removed some of those incentives for landlords to turn over rent-regulated apartments. The Wall Street Journal had a really good article on this, where they found that between June 2019 and November 2019, evictions were down by 46%, which is 35,000 less evictions than 2018. That was before COVID, but still an important statistic that should give your listeners insight into the power of our new rent stabilization system.
So things are improving for the rent stabilized tenants, but let's talk a little bit about people who might be in market rate units or newer units, and specifically the 421A program. I know your organization has done a lot of work on addressing allegations of fraud among landlords who are taking advantage of this. Could you tell us a little bit about 421A and some of the sketchiness around how landlords have operated using it?
Yeah, and a little bit of background into our organization. We take a no holds barred approach to investigating and generating class action lawsuits against predatory landlords. There was an audit conducted on all rent stabilized buildings. They actually used a sample of about 1,000 landlords, and this audit was conducted by the state government that found that a whopping 40% of them were illegally overcharging tenants in rent stabilized buildings. Just to give you some insight into how pervasive fraud is in general in New York City. Most of our lawsuits involve landlords who receive tax benefits in exchange for building new buildings and also providing rent stabilized apartments. But what we're also finding in these cases is that landlords aren't holding up their end of the bargain. They're receiving these tax benefits, but they are not complying with the rent stabilization laws. So what our organization does is we look at thousands of property tax statements. And to date, we have uncovered over 3,000 buildings that were or are receiving tax benefits, but aren't in compliance with rent stabilization laws. And it's very simple to identify these landlords, by the way. When landlords receive an affordable tax benefit, 100% of the building's units have to be rent stabilized. And on their property tax statements, it literally says how many rent stabilized units they registered in their building. So if the total number of rent stabilized units are less than 100% of their total units, it is unequivocally and factually illegal. And for example, in a case that we will be filing soon, the landlord has a 100 unit building, but on their property tax statements, 0 units are registered as rent stabilized. So we did the math. 0 is less than 100. Therefore, we know it's fraud. And to date, our organization has generated 70 class action lawsuits against predatory landlords and have gotten back millions of dollars for tenants and rent refunds. When all of our cases conclude, we estimate that thousands of tenants will win back anywhere from $150 to $200 million in rent refunds. And we're just a tiny little organization. And by the way, our mission is basically a suicide mission. We are calling on the government to do their jobs, right, and put our organization out of business. Our budget is approximately 1/25th of 1% of Governor Cuomo's Housing Enforcement Agency's budget. So if we're finding all of this fraud, imagine what the government would be able to find if they did their jobs.
Absolutely, and it's very I don't know if frustrating is the right word, but it seems like the fraud is so pervasive in the system, as you say, but DHCR, which is the state agency that handles this, hasn't been more proactive in going after landlords when they have this, rent registry that can show. A lot of times it's like right there on the page.
Totally, and it's literally third grade math, right? It's if a building has 100 units and less than 100 units are rent stabilized, it should be investigated. Like, I would love to say what we're doing is like ingenious, but it's actually quite simple.
Absolutely, and it gives you a window into sort of like the Wild West that a lot of landlords operate in, where the law is sort of optional to them.
Totally.
So that was kind of everything that was happening before COVID. Obviously, the COVID crisis hit New York City super, super hard. A lot of people in economic distress. A lot of people haven't been able to pay their rent in the last year. Do you expect to see a wave of evictions as housing court reopens and eviction moratoriums expire? I think we're now at, is it April that the eviction moratorium goes through? I actually don't know the latest, but they keep extending it, but it's eventually going to expire, and it's unclear if there's going to be more assistance ahead of that.
Yeah, right. I mean, we will see what happens, but to answer your question as to whether there'll be a flood of evictions when these moratoriums eventually expire, I mean, we'll see if they get renewed, but if not, potentially there will be, because housing isn't a right in America like it is in most OECD countries. Tenants in other developed nations are on better footing than America because they already have robust rental assistance programs in place. I mean, the UK spend 1% of the UK's GDP. The UK spends about 1% of their GDP on rental assistance. Finland, it's like 0.9%. Germany, it's around 0.7%. The United States is about 0.1, 0.2% of their GDP is spent on rental assistance. So we're in bad shape because of past policy decisions that were made that are now affecting us today. And we say we're a country of family values. So why don't we put our money where our mouth is and invest in families? I mean, renters will owe an approximate $30 billion to $70 billion in back rent, more than they could ever pay off. So some of the data on evictions here, I mean, is pretty astounding. And in New York State overall, just to use an example, New York State, as many as 1.2 million households are at risk of eviction. And there are a ton of backlog cases that could result in evictions during the pandemic. New York City landlords, for example, have filed 37,000 evictions since the pandemic began. And it's important to keep in mind the tenants who had warrants of eviction placed on them before the pandemic. There's an estimated backlog of 150,000 eviction cases before the pandemic began in mid-March in New York State. And that's just in New York State, right? Imagine in California and other states, they're going to have a big problem too if we're not doing enough on the rent and eviction moratorium front.
Yeah, and it's sort of challenging to get a sense of the scale of this, and I'm not sure a lot of policymakers have really reckoned with it yet. Like, what do you think is like the scale of the delinquency problem for tenants in New York State, and is there any, I don't know, urgency among state policymakers or city policymakers to offer assistance to tenants to try to get out of this hole?
Yeah, I mean, renters have been hit the hardest by the pandemic, and it's hardest for them to find relief. And this is especially true for low-income renters and renters of color. So let's use New York State as an example. Nearly 1 in 5 renter-occupied households in New York State are not currently caught up in rent payments. 33% of Black households in New York State are not currently caught up on rent payments. And it's something like 35% of renter-occupied households in New York State say they're somewhat or very likely to leave their home in the next 2 months because of eviction. And 50% of households in New York State experience loss of employment income since March. So tenants are in very bad shape here and seriously need relief. And at a national level, in the most recent COVID relief bill, $25 billion, will be allocated to emergency rental assistance, which is big, but it's nowhere near enough, like not even close. The National Low Income Housing Coalition estimates that we need about $70 billion in order to help families completely pay back rent arrears and to keep people in their homes. So we really need to push the Biden administration and Congress to meet this urgent need for rental assistance, or we're going to have serious problems in the very near future.
I mean, it's a very troubling situation, and as you say, it's low-income renters are the ones who are most likely to be behind on their rent payments, and also the ones who are going to have the most trouble to catch up. In some cases, it's just like an impossible burden, and I don't really see how the problem can be fixed without Congress or the state stepping in at this point.
100%.
So I also wanted to talk about, I know you're like me in favor of the plan to upzone SoHo, which is one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in New York City. Why do you feel that upzonings like this are a win for tenants in New York City?
Well, I'll say, it is critically important for higher income communities to do their fair share when it comes to housing. Low income households competing against high income households for a limited number of affordable units is part of the reason, and I want to emphasize the word part there, why we have an affordability crisis. We know, based on research done by organizations like the National Low Income Housing Coalition, that apartments are affordable to low income households aren't only occupied by low income households. To this point, in America, there are about 7 million homes affordable to extremely low-income households, and 1.3 million of those households are occupied by middle or above middle-income households. And that reduces the number of affordable homes available to extremely low-income households by almost 20%. So to put it another way, high-income households live in some of the most affordable units, which is why it is important to build housing at every income level. If low and high-income households are competing for the same housing, low-income families will always lose. And it's not enough for rental incomes to just be affordable. They also need to be available. But some nuance here, and I think this is very important for people to remember. As important as supply is to the conversation of affordable housing, it is also important to recognize that supply on its own will never, ever be enough. For the bottom 20% of income earners, we need to go beyond just supply. And take Houston, for example, which builds more housing than like any large city in America. Houston deserves a ton of credit for creating one of the most affordable large cities for middle and working class residents in America. But we also can't forget to shame cities like Houston. Compliment them, but also shame them. Why? Because for extremely low income households, Houston is one of the least affordable large cities in the country because they rely too heavily on the free market. And therein lies the importance of affordable housing, social housing, public housing for the low income families, which is wholly lacking in cities like Houston. So we need to do two things. Yes, you need to create a lot more housing, but you also need to create a lot more affordable housing.
To me, SoHo is such a, I don't know, extreme example because it is really like one of the wealthiest zip codes or census tracts or whatever neighborhoods in the United States, and also like so centrally located. It's on top of several different transit lines. Seeing extremely wealthy people, millionaires in SoHo, up in arms about this idea that they're going to have to allow more housing in their neighborhood, I think it's like it really drives home how unfair the system in New York has been.
Yeah, totally. I mean, some people in Manhattan, I think they live in Montana. Manhattan, has tall buildings, and Manhattan needs more housing. It's an extremely desirable area, and the SoHo plan would create 3,400 units, 600 to 900 of which would be income restricted, affordable units, and we will be pushing the city to make those units affordable for tenants making 40% or less of the area median income, which would be roughly $900 a month rents for families of three, making $40,000 a year in a neighborhood where the median income is $150,000 and the asking rent is $4,000 a month. There are only 21 income restricted units in SoHo. So this would increase the total number of income restricted units by roughly 4,000%. 4,000%. In 2017, a study by the Furman Center found that SoHo ranks number one for median household income, number one for median sales price per condominium unit, number one for school performance, number one for access to subways, number one for median rent, and number 48 for racial diversity, right? Like New York City is roughly 25% Black, SoHo is 1% Black, and some will argue that any new housing in SoHo would be out of character with the neighborhood. However, I would argue that the neighborhood of SoHo is out of character with New York City. And this is what people need to remember, that a neighborhood's character doesn't just come from its buildings, it also comes from its people. And that's why SoHo needs to build more affordable housing so they can let other people of different incomes and different races in. It's a proverbial no-brainer to me.
I couldn't agree with you more. Very well put. So the SoHo rezoning and the opposition that we've seen from it, it's a little bit in contrast to some of the other neighborhoods in the city that are lower income or larger minority populations, where the rezonings have gone through or they've met with less effective opposition, in part because there are more vulnerable populations there. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and the contrast between what's happened in SoHo and what's happened in some other neighborhoods.
Yeah. So I was just, for disclosure, I was against the rezonings in areas like East New York and lower income areas of the city, and I'll explain why. The importance of creating affordable housing in high income areas really goes beyond ideology and is like firmly rooted in research and economics. There was a study by NYU that found that the city's mandatory inclusionary housing program, which requires developers to set aside a percentage of units for low-income tenants in return for being allowed to erect taller buildings, allows the city to create significant amounts of affordable housing in affluent neighborhoods. The high market rents in those neighborhoods can effectively cross-subsidize the affordable units on their own. But in weaker markets like East New York and Jerome Avenue, the market rents are too low to cover the cost of affordable housing, right? Sorry, of affordable apartments. And that's why in those areas, you're not going to see a lot of deep affordable housing without a ton of subsidies. So had the city been creating more housing in high income areas, it would have saved money, and then it could have used those savings to create more deeper affordable housing in low income areas. And the city's decision to confine its neighborhood rezoning plan to low income areas wasn't a policy decision. It was a purely political one. Had the city shifted its focus to high income areas, right, it would have created significantly more affordable housing. And those savings, as I mentioned, could have been redirected to fixing public housing and fighting homelessness and creating more affordable housing. So the city chose to unnecessarily drive up the cost of its subsidies in low-income areas to avoid a political liability in high-income areas. And people will ask, well, why don't high-income areas want affordable housing? And I think you have to view it like this. Like, New York City is a municipal corporation, and its most influential shareholders are affluent homeowners. And unlike a business shareholder, a homeowner can't diversify their largest asset, right, which is their home. Like, they can't buy a part of their house in Soho, they can't buy a part of their house in the Upper East Side, a part in Inwood, and so forth. So they use zoning as basically like an insurance policy to protect their property values, right, at the cost of society as a whole. And like, that's the problem of it. And like, that's what we're trying to fight against, that, you have incumbent homeowners and incumbent landlords who have this silent partnership that will do everything and anything to prevent affordable housing in their neighborhoods. And what has that gotten us in New York City? It's got us one of the most we are one of the most expensive and unaffordable places in America. And now people are leaving. Low income people are leaving because they can't afford to live here. And that's just sad. So we need to change that.
It definitely feels like New York is, for better or worse, approaching a real tipping point on the housing issue. And I hope our representatives in government are paying attention and can take the actions that they need to take to actually get us back on the right track. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
So that's the show for this week. Thank you again to Shanti and Aaron. Make sure to check out their organizations, Tenants Together and Housing Rights Initiative, respectively. I'll put a link to both organizations' websites in the show description. Make sure to check them out. They are great organizations and do great work. Thank you, as always, for watching. I want to know what you think of the show. So leave us a comment on our YouTube page or tweet to me at MTSW or at The Nabe Show. I read every piece of feedback and really appreciate hearing from you. This is only our second episode, and we're working really hard to make the show better. If you like the show, make sure you subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on. Subscribing to the show is absolutely free, and I'll let you know whenever we have a new episode available. See you next time.